quotient rule to find the derivative when you have a division of two functions. I've got one function divided by another function. So this would be something that's a little more complex than the simple power functions that we had before, like 1 over x cubed. You wouldn't use this rule for. You'd use the power rules for. So this is when we have a little more complex functions and I can't rewrite it as a power raised to a negative. Alright, so I've got a distinct function f of x divided by a distinct function g of x. And so the rule is, and this rule, it is important that you do it in the right order. So first thing you do is it's the denominator, the bottom function, g of x, as is, no derivative, just g of x. Then you multiply that denominator by the numerator's derivative. So now you take a derivative. Then there's a minus, not a plus, a minus. That's why you can't rewrite this, because it's a minus. Where the product rule had a plus, you could rewrite it. With the minus you can't, so you have to write it in this order. The denominator times the derivative of the numerator minus the numerator times the derivative of, and you'll notice, again, I'm only doing one derivative at a time. But now it's important that you follow the right order. It has to be the bottom function first, derivative of the top function, minus the top function times the derivative of the bottom function. All right? And that whole expression is on the top of the fraction, and on the bottom of the fraction, it's the bottom function squared, whatever that bottom function g of x is squared. Another way, the way I have the trick that was taught to me 20 years ago when I learned this, was we call this the high function. Alright, it's the one on top. We call this the low function. And the trick that I use to remember, it says sort of the trick to memorize. Alright, the derivative is low d high, the d means derivative, minus high d low, again d means derivative, over low. The low means low squared. Alright, so it's the low function, derivative of the high, the d high means derivative of the high, minus the high times the derivative of the low over the low, or even I like to just think about it as the low squared. Alright, so again, up to you, you just have to memorize it. There's a Heidi-Ho one that's similar, and you just one of those rules you have to practice, and memorize. Alright, so that's the trick that I use to memorize. So that's the trick I'll be using. So an example, first example. Alright, so here I've got my function. Again, I can't simplify that. There's no way to rewrite that as a power function. So I have to use the quotient rule. Alright, so this is my high function. This is my low function. Alright, so I'm going to write out the rule. The derivative is low d high minus high d low over low squared. Okay. Alright, so we're going to find the derivative and then simplify the numerator once we do that. That's after we find the derivative. Alright, so the derivative, it's the low function. Right, that's the low function. So it's the low function, and grouping symbols are important. So it's the group, that's the low function, 2x minus x squared, low function as is, times the derivative of the high function. Alright, so I take the derivative of the high function and put it here. That's what the d high means. The d high means derivative of the high. Alright, so the derivative of just the top function, the 4 is a constant, it zeroes away. Negative 7 comes along because the derivative of x is just 1. Alright, so there's the low d high, and then there's a minus. You can't forget the minus. High. So the high function without changing it. D low. So now I'm going to take the derivative of the low function. Alright, so the derivative, I'm just looking at the low function. Its derivative, so the derivative of 2x is 2. Minus the derivative of x squared, which is going to give me a 2x. Alright, so there's the low, derivative of the high, minus the high, derivative of the low, all over the low function squared. The whole thing. So in parentheses. So where I have parentheses, you need parentheses. Because it's important so that we simplify correctly. Alright, so we're just going to simplify the numerator. So don't ever square out the denominator. Right, always leave that squared. Only place we can simplify is the numerator. Second thing is, do not cancel this with this. You're always going to have the same expression up here as down here because of the rule, right? You have a low function up here and you have two low functions up there. But you cannot cancel those. All right, you can't. Don't reduce them. They don't reduce. You can't cancel them because you don't have the same factor in both terms. All right, you can't cancel unless you can factor and reduce. All right, no factoring here. All right, the only way to simplify this is to multiply this out. So I've got to distribute my x squared. I've got to multiply. And then when I do multiply, I still have this negative out front, so when I multiply that out, I'm going to leave it in parentheses. All right, so it's the first step into simplify the numerator. All right, so the denominator stays the same, so I'm going to go ahead and write it. So we don't forget it. You have to write the denominator, otherwise it's not equal to. Otherwise it's a false statement. Don't want false statements, want right statements. All right, so up top I distribute my negative 7. All right, so I'm going to get negative 14x. Plus, right, negative gives me a plus 7x squared. Minus, still need parentheses because I haven't taken care of that minus yet, what that multiplies out to be. Alright, so when I multiply that out, I'm going to take the 4 times the 2 to give me 8. That's my first. Outer, 4 times negative 2x is going to give me a negative 8x. Inside, negative 7 times 2 is going to give me a negative 14x. Negative 7x times a negative 2x is going to give me a positive 14x squared, if I can squeeze it in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this as 8 and 14 is going to give me negative 22x plus 14x squared. Alright, I just added the negative 14 and the negative 8, right? Because I had a negative 8 and a negative 14 that I had to get. Alright, I'm now going to distribute this negative and then collect like terms and I'm done. Right, the bottom stays, don't lose it. Write it down correctly. So again, I'm going to write it down so we don't forget to do that. Write that down. If you forget to do that, that's a false statement. We don't want false statements. Distribute my negatives, I get negative 8 plus 22x minus 14x squared. Alright, collect my like terms. So up top, I'm going to 7x squared. Actually, I'm going to write out my bottom before I forget. Alright, so I've got my 7x squared, negative 14, so I get negative 7x squared. Negative 14x, 22x is going to leave me with a positive 8x, and there's only the constant negative 8, and I'm done. All right, there is the derivative, and that's as simplified as it gets, right? Nothing reduces, nothing cancels, you're done. All right, that's the simplification of it. All right, let's do the second example. Find the derivative, simplify the numerator. So that's always going to be the case. You're always going to have to simplify the numerator. So this is the high function. This is the low function. So again, the rule is it's the low d high minus the high d low over the low squared. D stands for derivative. So those are my two derivative expressions. Alright, so my derivative, my low function, as is, 1 minus x times the derivative of the high. So the derivative of the top function is going to give me 2x minus 2. Then there's a minus, you can't forget, the high. Times the derivative of the low, the 1 zeroes out, but this is going to give me a negative 1 when I take the derivative of that, right, because there's the negative in front of the x. So negative 1. Alright, so there's two things I'm going to do here. This negative 1 can multiply with that negative 1 to make this a positive, right? When I multiply that out, that's going to become a plus. And then I've got to multiply here. Oops, and I forgot my denominator. I've said it to you guys, and I forgot to write my low squared, right? Don't forget that. It's easy to do. That's why I always try to write it down first, because it's easy to forget. So I'm going to write it down first so I don't forget it. All right, now the multiplication. So this is just going to become a plus here, and I'm going to do that in a second. So first thing I'm going to do is multiply this out. So I'm going to get 1 times 2x, which is 2x, negative 2, minus 2x squared, plus 2x. And again, this is going to become a plus because I'm taking this negative 1 times this negative 1. It's going to become a plus, that group. X squared minus 2x plus 3. And I have parentheses, but at this point I can actually drop them because there's no number to distribute. All right, there's just a positive 1. And so I could go ahead and drop them and just collect like terms in my last step. All right, so again, I'm going to write down my denominator so I don't forget. And then collect like terms. So I've got a negative 2x squared plus an x squared, going to give me a negative x squared. One of those cancels with that, so I'm just left with positive 2x. Negative 2, positive 3 is going to leave me with a plus 1. Alright, so I've got negative x squared plus 2 plus 1 up top, all divided by 1 minus x squared. And I'm done. That's as simplified as she gets. Alright, so that's the quotient rule. Right? And those you just have to practice and memorize. So the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. So practice, practice, practice. We'll stop there.